So my name is Jonas Staal. I'm a visual artist. I would like to start my presentation with this image that was sent to me by writer and political representative Musa Asarit of the National Liberation Movement of Azawad, which is a coalition of different ethnicities, different peoples from the northern part of Mali, in the region of the Sahara and the Sahel, which since 2012 have been fighting for their new independent state of Azawad, pretty much the size of 1.5 times France. And what really struck me when I saw this image was how it questioned my own understanding of the notion, the concept of the state. In the sense that I associate the idea of the state with a certain level of infrastructure. And I've been in this territory myself, and basically the new state of Azawad doesn't know any roads, hardly any running water, electricity, hospitals, schools, or whatsoever. So what you see here essentially is a representation of the state as a cultural expression, first of all, as an idea, which is represented in this intervention, this flag, this sign, or canvas, you might better say. And what it does is two things, this image of the emergent state of Azawad. It politicizes a territory, which I imagine for someone from the outside looks very undescriptive. It injects a history of a peoples that have been struggling since the end of the 19th century against French occupation, against its integration into the Malian state, against many foreign armies that are currently on their territory. But at the same time, it also projects a different imaginary of what a potential autonomy could be that has long been lost to the region. And for me, that image, that canvas, says everything about the role of art at the heart of political struggle. And I'm going to tell you the consequences that I've taken from this in my own practice. I'm the founder of an artistic and political organization which is called the New World Summit. We exist of about 15 different members from the field of art, architecture, design, diplomacy, philosophy, and we develop what we call parliaments for stateless and blacklisted political organizations. This is an example of such an architectural construction, such a parliament, in which we facilitate groups that are currently excluded from the space of so-called democracy, excluded from the political order. And in essence, we function as a kind of nomadic parliament. The first image you saw was from our first summit in Berlin. This was the second one in Leiden in the Netherlands. Image of the third parliament that we constructed in Kochi in India. And by being a nomadic parliament, we attempt to overcome and to explore the gray zones in between different political systems, in between different forms of blacklists, of so-called terrorist blacklists, in order to facilitate political discourse that today is systematically censored from the public domain. I think in the context that we're living in now, the context of the war on terror, this is a situation that concerns us all. Because as we heard already in the first lecture today, the concept of statelessness is a condition that is more and more a collective one. All the more reason to dive into the question, which are these histories that today, histories of resistance, that are today censored, literally blacklisted from the collective consciousness. I want to go a little bit deeper into the latest summit that we organized, New World Summit in Brussels, in the Royal Flemish Theatre, where we facilitated 20 20 unrecognized states, what we call stateless states. Here you saw all of their flags on the front of the theater. And here you see a series of maps that we've developed in collaboration with them. So each of these unrecognized states, stateless states, represents a very different understanding of the concept of the state, in the sense that sometimes we speak of autonomous territories, autonomous zones, autonomous regions. Sometimes we literally speak of groups that want full independence or full separation from an existing state. And these maps we used in the space of the parliament that we developed for the fourth summit. Basically, they're placed all around the arena of this parliament. And during a period of 3 days, the 20 representatives of these states kind of unfolded the histories behind each of these representations of their territory. They went into their different definitions of what a state is, could, or should be. They were all gathered in a kind of central map, what we call an alternative world map, that formed the backdrop of the space, which we see essentially as a kind of substructural map of the world as we know it. And during these 3 days, we literally unfolded you could say, took it as a script, as something that could be unfolded, different histories that manifested itself in the space, and occupied a new perspective of our common world. We refer to it as histories, in the plural, histories, according to the stateless. And I want to give you a few very concrete examples of the types of discourses that came out. This is Connie Ledesma, representative of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, which is one of the longest-standing guerrilla movements in our world today. Fought American occupation of their territory, fought the Marcos dictatorship, currently fighting many private companies buying up Filipino land, rendering indigenous and peasant populations stateless. And essentially, what the National Democratic Front fights for is not so much separation from the existing state of the Philippines, it's what they refer to as a parallel state, the state within the state. The state that has been built throughout decades of revolutionary struggle, that attempted to build the social needs that the state of the Philippines itself failed in providing. So when it comes to security of peasants and indigenous that are threatened by land grabbing, there's a new People's Army, the People's Army of the Revolutionary Movement, considered a terrorist organization today, to secure their interests. They've built alternative forms of infrastructure on the level of healthcare, on the level of education. They redistributed land to the peasants that lost it. They even legalized, some decades ago, gay marriage, which in the Philippines itself is not possible. So there you see, in essence, both on a social and ideological level, how the state within the state, how this parallel state has been built, has been developed. Another example that for us is a very important one is the Kurdish women movement. This is Dilar Dirik, speaking on behalf of the Kurdish communities of women, and I hope you've been following a little bit their struggle in the north of Syria, fighting the Islamic State and the Assad regime as we speak, where they've developed in Rojava 3 independent cantons that they refer to, politically speaking, as a model of democratic autonomy. The Kurdish women movement has been fundamental within the Kurdish question to develop a fundamental feminist critique of the concept of the state, which they regard as a series of patriarchal relations, a territorialization that in essence forms the basis of so much sorrow and so much struggles of their peoples. So they defend what they refer to as a practice of democracy that should be liberated, should be separated from the concept of the state. So instead of proposing a map of a specific designated territory, what Dilar proposed was this ideological map developed over decades of political democratic practice in the form of democratic confederalism, democratic autonomy. And in this region, in Rojava, in the north of Syria, where the Kurdish women movement is very active in fighting Islamic State, this is what has been developed in the midst of civil war, in the midst of heavy resistance, independent communities that function on a communal basis through assembly, through self-governing cantons, and through gender equal representation, co-presidencies, all cantons represented by women and men alike. So here you see a model of stateless democracy. That brings me back to Musa Agassarid here on the left. That is the person who sent me this photograph. I think all too often, we as artists are somehow thought to think the world and represent the world anew. But what for us is crucial is that we learn to recognize within the hell that is called the war on terror, that there are insurgent histories, that there are new worlds built right in front of us as we speak, that we should consider as ours, as the promise of insurgent histories, alternative political practices, that we should learn from, and that we should dedicate our capacity of representation to. This new alliance, that is what we consider as a new world to come, a necessary and urgent new world to come. Thank you.
To me, one of the pathologies of nationalism is that there is this yearning to connect the cultural unit in this ethno-cultural sense, Kurdish, the Basque, you name it, or Swedish or Dutch, to the political unit, to the state. And people want this unit to fit nicely. And it never fits, because however much you may do it territorially, otherwise there's always going to be somebody who doesn't fit within this unit. And so they try hard to fit it. And even those yearning for their own political community, let's call them whatever, oppressed groups or occupied groups or groups that are feeling that they need an expression of their nationalism, push for this. And what you described was a wonderful array of different institutions, say the Kurdish in northern Syria, different institutions that they managed to create in pushing for this. Why not be satisfied with that? Why push for something more? Why is it that that is something in their minds they see as interim and are not satisfied with? Why is everybody wanting that state, that ideal state that expresses their cultural identity?
Right. Well, I'm not, I think, very fitted to speak for them, but I can tell you about what I learned from them. And I think that it's very difficult to generalize organizations and their struggle for independence, whether they are prosecuted through blacklists as so-called terrorist organizations or otherwise rendered stateless, because these histories are so radically differentiated and pluriform in nature. And often, for example, in the case of the independent state of Azawad, that was the image that I started with, I mean, we're talking of peoples that have a very nomadic background, that never wanted a state in the first place, but that learned through a systematic occupation of their territory that speaking the language of the state was the only way of securing the most basic interests on the level of food, of water, of the most basic human needs that were taken from them. So I don't think the concept of the state is necessarily always the main reason. Like this nationalism is not necessarily the main reason for what these organizations are driven by. It's simply the kind of language that continues to territorialize our understanding of the practice of politics. And that's why I think it's so crucial also to think of alternative practices that come out of this research. For example, the Kurdish women movement, who I think very profoundly critiques the kind of colonial hegemonical dimensions of the very concept of the state and fights for a practice of democracy liberated or separated from the construct of the state. I think that's a very, very crucial start to start to think of what this practice of stateless democracy could be like. And I think that's something where the radical imaginary of art, how to practice, how to create the infrastructure in order to make that model of or practice of democracy a reality is really crucial. I think that's something that we can actually contribute to.
Thank you. Thank you very much.